Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're tracking down one of the absolute most fascinating things in modern economics, the global domino effect. We're going to map out exactly how massive global power dynamics and high-level diplomacy dictate the most local, on-the-ground economic realities. We're connecting dots that span across continents today, and by the end of this, you'll see exactly how deeply interconnected our modern world truly is.
Okay, let's dive into this. How does a handshake, literally just a closed-door meeting halfway across the world in Beijing, end up dictating what a commuter pays to fill up their gas tank in Johannesburg? I know, it sounds a bit like chaos theory, right? But it's actually a highly structured, highly predictable chain reaction of macroeconomic events. Today, we're going to walk through that exact chain reaction, piece by piece, using the freshest data from the recently concluded two-day summit in Beijing.
So let's start with Section 1, the catalyst, the Beijing summit.
This is exactly where our first domino falls. You see, to really understand this summit, we've got to look at the massive contrast between what the cameras saw and what actually happened behind closed doors. On the surface, total structured pageantry. We're talking tea sessions and working lunches. President Trump highlighted discussions on agriculture and AI, and even announced that President Xi agreed to buy 200 Boeing jets. He called the discussions fantastic trade deals. But beneath all that optimism, there were zero officially signed agreements. And more importantly, Beijing laid down a very clear warning that the Taiwan issue is still an absolute determining factor in their bilateral ties. It's a classic diplomatic balancing act, all smiles for the cameras, but very rigid boundaries behind closed doors.
Wendy Cutler over at the Asia Society Policy Institute hit the nail on the head here. She impartially pointed out the lack of visible deliverable, saying, "Each side has an interest in stability right now, but this doesn't mean we're going to become best friends." And that's absolutely crucial to remember. Both the US and China know they need economic stability, sure, but that deep structural friction, it is still very much there. True, long-term alignment is missing from the equation.
All right, moving on to Section 2, the energy pivot, reviving US-China oil trade.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this massive 95% collapse in US crude exports to China since 2023. We're talking a drop down to just 8.4 million barrels for 2025. But during the summit, boom, a pre-recorded statement from President Trump dropped, confirming China actually agreed to start buying American crude again. He even specifically mentioned Chinese ships heading to Texas, Louisiana, Alaska. Now, Beijing hasn't officially rubber-stamped this yet, but the market sees it as highly credible. This is a monumental directional shift. We are talking about taking a tiny, fractional trickle of trade and turning it back into a towering pillar of global energy flow.
And you know what happens when the world's biggest energy consumer signals a massive new demand from the world's biggest producer? The market reacts exactly how you'd expect. International benchmark Brent crude futures instantly surged past $107.30 a barrel. U.S. West Texas Intermediate futures jumped right alongside it. Just the mere prospect of millions of barrels suddenly being rerouted across the Pacific injected a massive premium right into the price of oil.
Which brings us down the domino chain to Section 3, the choke point, the Strait of Hormuz.
To figure out why China is suddenly so eager to buy American oil, we actually have to look at a completely different part of the world entirely. In a summit that was pretty light on firm agreements, there was this one area of rare, striking alignment between the US and China. According to the White House, both nations completely agreed, without a doubt, that the Strait of Hormuz absolutely must remain open, period. They supported the free flow of energy, and President Trump stated that China gave reassurances it wouldn't provide military equipment to Iran. When the two largest economies on the planet align this fast and this clearly on one geographical bottleneck, well, it tells you exactly how critical that spot is to the survival of the global economy.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why. A full 20% of the world's oil and liquid natural gas flows through this one narrow maritime passage. Right now, conflict in the Middle East, specifically Iran blocking maritime trade flows, is actively choking off that global supply. Think about that. 1/5 of the energy that powers our modern world is essentially trapped right now behind a geopolitical barricade.
And here is the exact underlying motivation for China's sudden deal in Beijing. This disruption in the Strait of Hormuz has completely cut off about a third, 33% of China's entire liquid natural gas supply. You just can't run an industrial powerhouse like China when a third of your LNG is suddenly inaccessible. This exact disruption is the immediate urgent reason they need to secure US energy, completely regardless of any broader trade tensions. Necessity totally forced their hand here. So, let's zoom in on the final domino in Section 4, the downstream impact emerging market squeeze.
So what does this all mean for the rest of the world? How does oil surging past $107 actually hit emerging markets? Well, it hits them right in the currency. Right after the Beijing summit and that spike in oil prices, the South African rand fell sharply in early trade. It slid 1% down to 16.64 against a strengthening US dollar. You see, when oil gets super expensive, investors immediately flee to the safety of the greenback, and that leaves emerging market currencies like the rand incredibly vulnerable.
And honestly, it's not just the currency taking a hit, it's the cost of debt. South Africa's benchmark 2035 government bond weakened too, with the yield rising up to 8.765%. This is a broader reassessment of sovereign risk across the board. Investors are looking at these emerging markets and realizing that sticky, high-energy inflation is going to heavily compress central banks from cutting interest rates. The South African Reserve Bank's room to ease monetary policy is literally evaporating, all because of oil prices driven by a meeting in Beijing and a blockage in the Middle East.
So the crucial point is how this translates to everyday pain. We call this imported inflation. It's what happens when a weakened local currency collides with skyrocketing global commodity prices. It acts like a massive, brutal, regressive tax, amplifying the cost of everyday imported goods, stuff like transport and food, right when household consumption is already stretched extremely thin. That handshake in Beijing, it triggered a commodity spike that effectively acts as a massive tax on the working class in South Africa.
Bringing us to our final section. Section 5, the road ahead, the defining variable.
At the end of the day, despite all the diplomatic goodwill generated in Beijing or those little relief rallies we sometimes see in the stock market, the economic reality for Africa and the broader emerging market complex is completely tethered to the physical flow of oil. The Strait of Hormuz is the defining variable here. No matter what diplomatic language was produced over tea in China, until maritime passage genuinely normalizes and oil drops back down from these triple-digit levels, the rand and African commodity markets are facing a structurally difficult environment. So it leaves us with one massive question. Until things normalize, can emerging markets actually survive this prolonged squeeze of triple-digit oil? It really makes you think about how fragile our global supply chains are and how an ocean away, a diplomatic working lunch is deeply intertwined with the daily life of a citizen in South Africa. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer today. Take a second to think about how these giant interconnected global systems impact your own local economy, and I'll catch you in the next one.